What is up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and it is finally here. We finally have Marvel's Spider-Man 2 in our lives. Of course, since I'm making this video, I've played it and I want to talk about it. So without further ado, let's rock. For anybody that's been watching this channel for a minute now may already know this, but I was super psyched for this game. It was my number 2 most anticipated game of 2023, second to only another monumental sequel, Tears of the Kingdom. I'm a huge Spider-Man fan. I grew up reading the comics, and I tell people a lot of times unsolicited that if it wasn't for my love of TMNT and Spider-Man, that I definitely would not be the nerd I am today. I certainly wouldn't be sitting here making YouTube videos. And if you read some of the comments, people might argue that that would have been for the best. Therefore, I was a big fan of the first Spider-Man game. I loved the Batman Arkham games, and they basically just ripped the combat system from those games and brought it to my favorite superhero of all time, Spider-Man. I especially love the web slinging. I could never get tired of just swinging around NYC. I also thought it was really interesting that in the Miles Morales expansion, they made the web slinging a bit different. He's not as used to being Spider-Man as Peter Parker, and so he wasn't as fluid with his web slinging. So I thought that was really kind of a neat touch in the expansion. So therefore, I was super excited to see these two come together in Spider-Man 2. Marvel's Spider-Man 2 was released on October 20th. Like the first game, Spider-Man 2 was developed by Insomniac Games and published by Sony Interactive. And as you might have guessed it, since it was published by Sony, this game is a PlayStation exclusive. However, unlike the first game and the Miles Morales expansion, this game is exclusive just to the PS5 and beating the story while doing some side content, but not all side content. I played this game for roughly 23 hours. While some might use the phrase more of the same in a negative light, they might argue that if a sequel is a majority of what you did in the first game, that can be stale. I actually argue the complete opposite. I want that for my sequels. If I played the first game and I'm playing the sequel, it's probably because I really enjoyed the first game. So give me more of that. Of course, I want you to add a few things here and there, which Spider-Man 2 definitely did, which we'll get to in a second. But when you're starting off with a phenomenal game like the first Spider-Man game and the Miles Morales expansion, you don't have to break the mold. Just give me more of the same. And as someone who grew up on the Spider-Man comics, the first game was everything I could have wanted from a Spider-Man game. I was smiling ear to ear, swinging through NYC. I got to square off against some of my favorite villains, and the story was one of my favorite video game stories of all time. I used to stream a lot more back then than I do now, and I literally almost cried on stream because of the first game's story. And Marvel's Spider-Man 2 gave me everything I loved from the first game and a little bit more, which is, again, exactly what I'm looking for from a sequel. While the story didn't make me cry this time around, I did get a little choked up at a few moments. I originally fell in love with Spider-Man as a kid because he felt like a real person. He wasn't a billionaire, he wasn't an alien, he was just a guy trying to make ends meet while keeping his friends and family safe and happy, who also just happened to be a really cool superhero. And you definitely feel that tightrope act from Miles and Peter in Spider-Man 2. Miles is still trying to cope with the death of his dad. That thread leads to one of the most effective emotional moments in the third act of the game. He's also dealing with his friends moving on without him while he feels stuck being Spider-Man's sidekick. Peter, on the other hand, is trying to keep his head above water with the mortgage on his Aunt May's house, while also trying to convince a free-spirited MJ to move in with him. But low-key, one of my favorite aspects of Spider-Man is actually his villains. Therefore, I was really psyched for Kraven to take center stage in this game. Kraven's Last Hunt is one of my favorite Spider-Man comic arcs, and while I've seen Kraven's story in this game done before, I did like that it wasn't just a carbon copy of Kraven's Last Hunt. Even though I did dig that comic a lot, if I wanted that story, I would have just read the comic, so I definitely appreciated that they went a different way. But if you saw the gameplay reveal shown at San Diego Comic-Con, which if you haven't, I did a reaction video on this channel that you can watch. However, I do have to warn you that some of the hot takes that I made in that video kind of aged like sour milk now that I played the game. But if you saw that gameplay or you saw any other promo material, you know that Venom is the real big bad of this game. And I think the game does a really good job slow playing the Venom stuff. The symbiote first starts off with Harry, then it moves to Peter, and then it moves again, which I won't spoil who it ends up with. And if you've read the comics or frankly seen Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3, you kind of know the beats of this story. Unlike the Kraven stuff, the game really doesn't go off the beaten path with the Venom story. Peter gets the symbiote, it makes him more powerful, and he kind of starts to feel like he needs it to be the best Spider-Man he can be. However, Venom slowly takes over his mind, making him more and more violent. Therefore, Miles has to step up and be the real Spider-Man, while also having to figure out a way to separate Venom from Peter. Speaking of Peter and Miles, you roughly play equally as both. Typically, for example, when you finish a mission with Peter, he will quote unquote check in with Miles, which then the game switches you to Miles. You also have an option to switch between the characters using the app. There are, of course, plenty of missions where you play as both, including the one they showed off in the gameplay reveal trailer that I mentioned earlier, where Peter is first being taken hold by the symbiote and the duo is chasing down the lizard while avoiding Kraven's hunters. One of my favorite gameplay moments from the game. It's an absolute blast. But of course, there are side quest content that are Peter or Miles specific, and there is a lot of side content in this game like there was in the first game and the expansion. If you've played those other games, you know the drill. You beat a particular mission and it will unlock the corresponding side content. That content is then marked on your map, or at least it becomes available to be marked on your map. Your map will then keep track by section of the city how much side content you have completed in that area. The more side content you complete in that section, the better rewards you will get, including a seamless fast travel to that area. Now, I haven't platinumed this game yet. I'm only about 23-ish hours into it, and a majority of that was the main story. I did complete a lot of stuff as I went along, but I haven't completed everything yet. But my favorite side content is, in order to help make ends meet, Peter takes a job as a photographer for his old friend at the Bugle. And I know it sounds silly that taking photos in this big action adventure game like Marvel Spider-Man 2 was my favorite side content. But as I'll get into here in a little bit, Insomniac Games does a phenomenal job bringing NYC to life. So a lot of times you're taking photographs of these really cool things, and depending on who you're taking a photograph of, sometimes they will bust your balls for taking their photos. For example, I took a photo of a wrestler warming up for his match, and he was like, "Hey man, if you want the best photos, you should actually pay to see the match," which I thought was pretty funny. Also, growing up as a Spider-Man fan, the reason I fell in love with Peter Parker as a character was because he was struggling to make ends meet. And part of that was he worked as a photographer for the Daily Bugle. So I really loved that the game incorporated that part of his story into the game. There's also a cool side mission where you play as Miles' sort of girlfriend as she paints over graffiti. And it was a nice breath of fresh air from the Spidey combat. And for the most part, the combat is the same in Spider-Man 2. It's going to kind of feel like you're riding a bike if you've played the past games. The biggest addition is Insomniac must have been playing a lot of Soulsborne games, because you can now parry attacks in Spider-Man 2. It is pretty simple. You still have your Spidey sense that will go off above your head when you're about to take damage. Now, if you wait a beat, that notification will actually turn red. At that point, you hit the L1 button and you can actually parry your opponent, which usually leads to staggering them and giving you either a health boost or more focus, or depending on the abilities you have unlocked, it might actually give you both. While I did like the addition of the parry, it did honestly take me a minute to get used to it. I'm so used to the older games and the Arkham games that uses a similar combat system that I have years and years of that muscle memory. So it took me a minute, probably too long if I'm being completely honest, to get used to the parrying ability. But once I did, I had felt like an absolute badass. There were multiple just waves and waves of enemies that I could defeat without even taking any damage. There were even boss battles that I fought that once I got used to the boss's moves, it kind of felt like I was playing a Soulsborne game in this sense, that I basically would take 0 damage in the whole boss battle because I would just parry all their moves. I do have to admit that I was surprised at, I don't want to say the lack of boss battles because there's plenty of boss battles in Spider-Man 2. It was the amount of playtime in between the boss battles that caught me off guard. Literally the first thing you do in Spider-Man 2 is fight a giant Sandman. It's essentially the game's tutorial. Then there's another almost 12 hours before I fought another, what I would consider a real boss. Now the third act is boss battle after boss battle, so there's plenty of them in the game. I just found it strange that there was none in the early to middle part of the story. However, my biggest complaint about the combat in Spider-Man 2 is it doesn't really feel like it mattered which character you played as, whether it's Miles or Peter. You're basically able to accomplish everything outside of the specific side content for that character without any trouble. I mentioned the giant Sandman battle earlier, and because Miles has electricity, he's able to take out the minions a lot easier than Peter. And then later in the game, Peter gets an ability that makes him stronger against Venom in the symbiote. However, that's pretty much it. Outside of those two things, there really wasn't a battle that I felt like it mattered whether I played as Peter or Miles. So I wish there was a little bit more of that in this game. And I'm sure when some of you heard me say my biggest complaint about the combat, you were probably thinking I was going to mention the Mary Jane sections, which were easily the worst part of the first game. But to their credit, Insomniac must have heard our complaints because her sections in this game are way more fun this time around. Sure, she's not a spider person, but she does have her taser that she upgrades throughout the game. She's still weak if she gets caught, but it felt like more like the early stages of a Plague Tale game than what we had in the first Spider-Man game. I did feel more like a badass sneaking around tasing bad guys. She's not the helpless MJ that we got in the first game. Outside of the parry and MJ being kind of a badass, the biggest change from the first game is the addition of the wingsuit. As much as I love the swinging in the other games, and I did absolutely love it, it was nice that they gave us something new in the sequel. Like the parry, it did take me a second to get the hang of the wingsuit, but once I did, I fell in love with it as well. It was a nice change of pace to just swinging all the time. It was especially fun when you catch a wind tunnel. There's even a trophy that you have to use your wingsuit to get from one corner of the map to the other, which sounds more difficult than it actually was once you get good at the wind tunnels. I will admit though, going over the rivers in this game, if you didn't catch a wind tunnel or you weren't near a bridge, was super annoying. There was a couple of times where I had to swim a little bit because I goofed it. As I mentioned early in this video, this game is a PS5 exclusive. I know that's going to alienate some gamers who, due to either supply issues or financial reasons, haven't upgraded to the PS5 yet. Especially annoying because you can play the first 2 games on PS4. I know this isn't going to make me too many friends, but I do think it makes sense that this game is exclusive to the new console because it looks outstanding on the PS5. The fidelity during the cutscenes is top notch. I love swinging through the city, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, and a big part of why I love it so much is how great the city looks. I know the cliche thing to say here is the environment is its own character, and I hate that expression. However, NYC has always gone hand in hand with me with Spider-Man, so I love that the city looks so great in this game. And finally, I want to end this review by talking briefly about the sound design and music. And as pretty much everything was across the board in Spider-Man 2, the sound design was top notch. There's even a moment in the game where Harry's giving Peter a tour and his voice as he walks into an elevator becomes a little echoey, and then when he walks out his voice goes back to normal. And I thought there was a lot of like those little details that I noticed as I was playing this game that I was like, man, they really went above and beyond with the sound design. Now the music, there was some interesting choices with the music. For example, again, there was a moment with Harry and Peter where they're playing a Shin song, which I like that song a lot. I just didn't really feel like it fit the moment while they're just playing some basketball. They're playing a Shin song in the background. I thought that was a little weird. But on the flip side, there was a moment in a side content where you're literally herding a bunch of pigeons and you're kind of cruising across the city with your wingsuit, and they're playing this song. I didn't recognize the song, but it was really cool. It just brought an ambiance to that moment. So the music and sound design across the board, like everything else, was great. So out of 5 stars, I'm going to give Marvel's Spider-Man 2 4.5. This game was everything I wanted from a sequel to one of my favorite games from a few years ago. The story was amazing, didn't make me cry, but it came real close a couple of times. The villains were great. The boss battles, even though there was that weird gap in between boss battles, was a lot of fun. They added stuff to the combat, like the parry, like MJ not being completely helpless anymore, that made the game even better than I thought it could be. So all in all, I was so happy with this game. But as always, those are just my thoughts on Marvel Spider-Man 2. I'd love to hear yours in the comments down below. Of course, I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button, as the kids say. If you did enjoy it, definitely consider subscribing and dinging that bell. That way you're notified every time I post another video. I try to post weekly gaming related content. So if you dig that type of stuff, definitely consider subscribing and dinging that bell. But until next video, take it easy. What's up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and this is my boy Yoshi, aka Kitty Boy. And we were just talking, and we agree that since you made it this far in the video, you might as well subscribe. You wouldn't want to disappoint Kitty Boy, would you?